Hi mateys and welcome back to my channel. This is one of those boring history videos that nobody watches anyways. Oh no, sorry, I should have said... Okay, I'll do this again, alright? Right. So hi mateys, this is one of those very interesting and fascinating history videos that everybody loves. Sometimes. This one is going to be about music and pirates, which you might have noticed is also the general theme of my whole channel, but today we are going to be more specific about history and pirates. I have dealt with this subject very briefly in one of my previous videos that you should find either in the description or in the title card, whatever works best. And that was about the Gurdy and pirates. Today instead I'm going to tackle with the general subject. Did the pirates actually play any music themselves, or did they like music, did they compose any music of their own? Let's see what we know about that. We don't have many primary sources. The pirates themselves didn't actually write diaries or memoirs or anything of their own, unless Captain Johnson, the one who wrote the general history of pirates, was a pirate himself. That's a possibility, but we have no idea of who Captain Johnson was actually. And that was probably just a pen name, a fake name he used to write the book. So we only have secondary sources, and of course all the other sources, like modern books to explore the subject of piracy in general. Now, given this very small amount of data, it's kind of very hard to make any guesses. Also, we should keep in mind that when I say piracy, I usually speak about the golden age of piracy, which is a time span of 20-30 years, nothing more than that. And in that time span, there were, according to Cordingley's esteem, there were a total amount of around 4,000 pirates. So we're not talking about a very large population, and that means that any theory based on statistics is going to be very feeble. While we can guess that, I don't know, if we would have to just only statistically imagine if there ever was a man in medieval France who played a certain instrument, well, we can be fairly sure, because we are talking about a very large population, about a very large time span. But when we're talking about pirates, the chances grow very slim, if we're talking just about statistics. So, what about the sources? I actually read a few books lately. There was one of my subscribers who asked me what the best books about piracy are. To date, I would say everything written by Cordingley is great, and this one by Gabriel Kuhn, Life Under the Jolly Roger, Reflections on Golden Age Piracy, is also a very good one. This one is more generic, like it explores piracy as a phenomenon, it's not really going into detail of the actual lives of real pirates. This one goes more into detail on Woodes Roger's life, who was a privateer actually, whatever, and there are other books by Cordingley. It's all good stuff anyways. So, but what I gathered here is actually quite interesting. Now, if we would like to know whether actual pirates ever played any music themselves or wrote music, here is what Gabriel Kuhn says. Most pirates, according to reports, like to listen to music, usually played by musicians who most of the times were forced to join the crew. The musicians who were arrested, together with Bartholomew Roberts' crew, reported to have been mistreated, and blah 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 blah. Actually, Bartholomew Roberts' code, the pirate code that he and his crew subscribed to, actually has a specific article about musicians, which says that they are allowed to rest on Saturdays, but apart from that, they have to play whenever they are asked, unless they have a special permit for whatever reason. Now, this is, in my opinion, very interesting because it means that, and if you have a special rule in the pirate code for musicians, it means that you assume that you're going to have musicians most, if not all of the time, on board. Otherwise, you won't treat them specifically in an article. Also, the treatment sounds kind of harsh. I mean, you have to play like 24/7, no, 24/6 actually, because you have 1 day of rest, unless you are sick or whatever and you get a special permit. It sounds like a not a very gentle treatment, and yet is not even the treatment reserved to a slave who has to work 24/7. They're treated separately from the rest of the crew in these articles, so we could assume they were not considered pirates, so not an integral part of the crew, but something added to the actual crew. That's interesting in itself. But then I have another source, this one, David Cordingly's book. This one is mostly about Woodes Rogers, as I said, and in this particular part of his voyage, this is not about when he becomes the governor of Nassau, as we see in Black Sails, for example. This happened before, when he was a privateer. He and the crew actually reached this village called Angra dos Reis, which is a Portuguese settlement, and the Portuguese actually welcome quite warmly the English. They invite them to a special ceremony dedicated to the Virgin Mary. And here it says, Rogers, Courtney and some of the officials, accompanied by the musicians of the ships, joined the congregation for the Mass. The musicians were seated in the gallery, and they brightened the whole Mass with loud shanties played with trumpets, oboes, and violins. Okay, lots of information in a very small sentence. First of all, they had musicians on board, and that's considered normal, apparently. Secondly, they have many musicians on board, because here we're talking about trumpets, oboes, and violins, which, it means that they had at least 2 trumpets, at least 2 oboes, and at least 2 violins. That's just mathematics, and probably even more. So this means that they had at least 6 musicians on board, which is a lot if you consider they went on a privateering expedition, so they needed mostly sailors and fighters because they were going to fight Spanish gold galleons. And the crew was not very large in general. So, saving room on board for 6 musicians is quite something, especially if you consider that Woodes Rogers was not a rich man. The whole expedition was funded with private and public money. He had almost none, and therefore the musicians were not there only for the enjoyment of the captain. Quite the opposite, in fact. Not to mention the fact that they could have other instruments on board, and other musicians that are not quoted here in this particular passage. Also, there is an explicit reference to shanties. Now, I'm afraid this is an Italian version, but it says literally, sailors work songs. So you cannot be more specific than that. That's a shanty, in the definition. So a piece of vocal music which is sung by sailors while they are working to help them, relieve stress, or just simply coordinate their rhythm when pulling and pushing and all the rest. So, and last but not least, it means they already considered shanties a genre by themselves. Something that could be either sung or played with instruments. So that's already a lot of information from a very small sentence. Again, the point here is that this is a privateering expedition. These were not pirates. Even though we all know that the difference between privateers and pirates tends to be quite slim at some point. So this does not tell us anything about which songs actually the pirates played or sang. We have a reference to shanties, and when I say shanty, you're probably thinking about all the stuff you can listen to in Assassin's Creed Black Flag. There's a lot of beautiful shanties in that video game, don't get me wrong, but most of them are actually from the 19th century as far as we know, so they were probably written later than the golden age of piracy. Even though it is thought that a few shanties might have been older than that. But you know, those are oral traditions, we don't know anything for sure about those. So, whatever they sang, they did have shanties already, which were probably normal sailor shanties. I might guess that on pirate ships, shanties tended to be more rude and there would be more swearing and, you know, more freedom of thought in general, more calling names, etc. But that's, you know, just my opinion. I have no proof for that. Though we can be sure that they actually sang shanties, because all sailors did, except in the Navy, I think. Maybe not in the Royal Navy. And we also know that they played brass, so it says trumpets, oboes and violins, which were probably the most frequent and more widespread instruments of that time. Of course, there are others like the harpsichord, but how could you actually bring a harpsichord on board? That's not something you would have with you, you know, it's just so clumsy. So, among small instruments, these three are kind of the more portable, of course. Like cellos are larger than violins, so not very handy, etc., etc. One last point I want to make is that while trumpets are and have always been instruments played on the battlefield in armies, by marching armies, by kings, etc., so they are kind of more of a military political instrument than a musical instrument itself. Violins are actually for classical or folk music. So, in my opinion, the presence of violins clearly means that these privateers actually wanted to listen to music on board for pleasure and nothing else. So, in conclusion, did the pirates actually play any music? Could be. Some of them, perhaps, but not that many. Surely they could sing, less likely that many of them could play, but if they could not, they would find a way to hire or kidnap a few musicians to play on board. That's my stance on this subject, at least for the time being. So if you want to know more about pirate history, please remember to watch my other videos about pirate curses, black sails and history, and the hurdy-gurdy and pirate music. See you and subscribe to my channel, landlubber.